They still tell it in every port from Logtown to the New World. The day the sky over the Grand Line didn't tear, didn't scream, didn't warn anyone at all. It just opened, quiet as a held breath. And through that opening walked something that had never once, in 400 years of pirates and kings and gods dressed as men, needed to raise its voice to be obeyed. They called him a cat. He did not appreciate that. A being who erases planets from existence with the flick of one finger. A god who has never lost. Dropped into a world already ruled by monsters. Yonko, admirals, an empire built on the bones of everyone who said no. One Piece has never met a power like this, and it is about to learn the difference between strong and absolute. This is Multiverse Saiyan. This is What If Beerus landed in One Piece. Script by Stanley Ned. Drop your own what if in the comments. I read every single one, and the next crossover might be yours. Subscribe, hit that bell, and buckle up, because the Grand Line just found out it isn't at the top of the food chain anymore. Long before the sailors of the New World had a name for what happened, the sea itself seemed to know something was wrong. It was a Tuesday, if such a thing still meant anything out past the Red Line, and the world government scout vessel Halcyon's Reach was 3 days into a routine sweep of a shipping lane that hadn't seen so much as a rumor of trouble in 6 months. Cipher Pol agent Marchetti stood at the bow with his ledger tucked under one arm, watching the horizon the way he watched everything, like it owed him an explanation it hadn't given yet. The sky did not tear. That was the detail no one who lived through it could ever quite make the poets understand. Later, when the balladeers tried to dress it up with thunder and torn fabric and prophecy. It did not scream, it simply opened. A seam of violet-black nothing unstitched itself against the blue, no wider than a ship's mast, hanging perhaps 400 feet above the waterline, silent as a held breath. Marchetti would later write in his report that the strangest part wasn't the way the air around the rift seemed to fold inward on itself, like the edge of a wound that healed the wrong direction. The strangest part was the quiet. Not one gull cried, not one wave broke wrong. The ocean, which had opinions about everything, had no opinion about this at all. Something stepped through it. It did not fall. It did not stumble through the way shipwrecked men fell from broken masts, or devil fruit users tumbled from failed flight. It walked, unhurried, down through empty air as though a staircase existed there that only it could see. 400 feet above a sea it had never laid eyes on, in a world it had no memory of ever needing to visit. Small, slight, purple-skinned, cat-eared, wrapped in robes the color of a dying sunset, with an expression of profound, weary irritation, as if the universe had interrupted a very good nap to deposit him here. Beerus, god of destruction of Universe 7, looked down at the endless blue below him, at the small wooden speck of a ship with its small wooden speck of a crew staring up in open-mouthed horror, and sighed with the specific exhaustion of a being who has just realized he is, once again, going to have to deal with something. Whis, he said, to no one, because Whis was not there, had never come through the rift with him, and would not for some time yet. This had better not be another one of your scenic detours. No answer came. Beerus's ears flattened, just slightly. The first true tell. Had anyone aboard the Halcyon's Reach known him well enough to read it, that his mood had gone from irritated to genuinely displeased. On the deck below, chaos arrived in the ordinary human way it always does, not with understanding, but with noise. Someone screamed. Someone else, more usefully, rang the alarm bell. Marchetti did neither. He stood very still at the rail, ledger forgotten at his side, and watched the impossible thing hang in the sky, and felt the specific, cold vertigo of a career intelligence officer realizing in real time that every category he owned was about to prove insufficient. "Sir," the Halcyon's Reach's young captain said at his shoulder, voice cracking on the word, "Orders." Marchetti did not look away from the sky. "Do not fire," he said. "Do not approach. Get me a Vivre card transmission to Marineford. Now." Beerus descended the rest of the way at his own unhurried pace. Boots, if they could be called that, never once touching the water, until he stood in the air perhaps 20 feet above the ship's deck, looking down at the assembled Marines with the mild, faintly disgusted curiosity of a man discovering an unfamiliar insect in his kitchen. "Interesting," he said to himself, surveying the wooden ship, the cannons, the flag snapping overhead with its skull and crossed swords insignia. Primitive, loud, ugly architecture. His golden eyes swept across the deck, across 40-some Marines now frozen between raising weapons and fleeing outright, and settled, almost lazily, on the largest cannon mounted at the ship's prow. "You people," he continued, in the tone of someone continuing a conversation no one else had been part of, "still fight with explosions. How dreadfully primitive. One Marine, younger than the rest, and either braver or stupider, history would later debate which, did the thing every story like this eventually turns on." He raised his rifle. Marchetti did not have time to shout the order to stand down before the shot went off. What happened next took less than half a second, and every witness aboard the Halcyon's Reach described it differently for the rest of their lives, because the human mind was not built to hold the shape of what it saw. The bullet crossed the 20 feet of air between the rifle and Beerus's chest. It did not miss. It did not deflect. It simply was not, a foot before it reached him, the way a word is not once it's been unsaid. No flash, no sound, no visible motion from Beerus at all beyond the faint, bored flick of one finger, so small a gesture it might have been mistaken for him brushing away a fly. The silence that followed was the loudest thing any of them had ever heard. Beerus's gaze moved, slow and deliberate, to the young Marine who'd fired. His ears, already flat, pinned back fully now, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger exactly, not yet, but the specific attention of a being recalibrating exactly how much patience this world was going to be permitted. "You," Beerus said, "just tried to shoot a god." He said it not as a threat. He said it the way a teacher points out an obvious, embarrassing mistake to a student who should have known better. That, more than anything, more than the vanished bullet, more than the silent rift still hanging in the sky behind him, was what convinced Marchetti, in that instant, that the correct response to this creature was not force. It was information. It was time. "Stand down," Marchetti barked, his voice cutting through the deck like a blade, and to his own faint surprise, every Marine obeyed instantly, weapons lowering, because in the absence of any other authority on that deck, his was the only voice still steady. He stepped forward, alone, into the open space beneath the floating god. Hands visibly empty, ledger left behind at the rail. "My apologies," Marchetti said, and meant it, and kept his voice level through sheer force of will. That was an error in judgment, not an order from this ship's command. Beerus's attention swung to him instead, and Marchetti felt it land like a physical weight, the specific, total quality of being seen by something that could unmake him with less effort than it took to blink. He did not look away. Whatever else was true about Cipher Pol, they trained you not to look away. "You're the one in charge," Beerus said. "It wasn't a question." "I'm the one asking the questions for now," Marchetti said. "You're not from here. That much is obvious. My job is to find out what you are and whether this world needs to be worried about you." For a long moment, nothing happened. The rift behind Beerus pulsed once, faintly, then began, slowly, without violence, to seal itself shut. The seam of violet-black nothing folding closed the way it had opened, until the sky above the Halcyon's reach was simply sky again, blue and empty and giving no hint that anything had ever been wrong with it. Beerus watched it close with an expression Marchetti couldn't read, then looked back down at him. "Good question," Beerus said, and for the first time, something almost like genuine interest crossed his face. Not warmth, nothing so generous as warmth, but the specific curiosity of a being who has just realized the insects in this particular kitchen might, at minimum, be worth watching before he decided whether to step on them. Should it be worried about me? He considered this, tail flicking once behind him, and settled slowly, unhurried, down onto the deck itself, boots finally touching wood, standing now at a height barely level with Marchetti's chest, and radiating, despite it, an authority that made the ship's very timbers feel like they were holding their breath. "Depends entirely," Beerus said, "on how annoying you people turn out to be. Word of what happened aboard the Halcyon's reached Marineford in 11 hours. Fast for a Vivricard relay, faster than any single piece of news had traveled through official channels in longer than most serving Marines could remember. It reached the war room of the Gorose in 14, delivered in person by a courier who had not stopped moving since Marchetti's initial dispatch and who, upon finishing his report, sat down on the floor outside the chamber and did not get up again for some time. The 5 elders did not raise their voices. They rarely did. It was, in its way, the most dangerous thing about them. But the silence that settled over the war room after the courier's report was a different silence than usual. Not the patient, predatory quiet of men accustomed to controlling every variable in a room, but something thinner, more brittle, the silence of men doing arithmetic they did not like the answer to. "A bullet," one of the elders finally said. "Simply ceased. Not deflected," another corrected, reading from the written transcript. "Not absorbed. The witness statements are consistent on this point, and Marchetti is not a man given to poetic exaggeration in his reports. The bullet did not strike anything. It was, in the agent's words, unmade, mid-flight, before contact." A long pause. "Get me Sengoku," the eldest said at last, "and send word to the admirals, all 3. I want them briefed before this reaches the papers, and it will reach the papers. Something crossed the sky above open water in front of 40 witnesses, and 40 witnesses talk." He set down the report, folding his hands, and looked toward the window, toward the vast gray line of the horizon beyond it, as if he might, if he looked hard enough, see all the way out to wherever this thing had come from. This is not a devil fruit. This is not a bloodline. This is not anything in any file this organization has ever compiled in 400 years of compiling files. His voice, when it continued, had gone very quiet. I want to know what it is. I want to know what it wants. And I want to know it before a Yonko does. Because if Big Mom or Kaido finds a way to make an ally, or a weapon, out of whatever crossed into our world today, we will not survive the mistake of having been slow. 300 miles east, aboard a ship flying a banner that had not yet chosen to announce itself to the wider world, a very different conversation was already underway, because the sea, as it turned out, had more than one set of ears. A woman with sharp eyes and sharper instincts standing at the wheel of a New World pirate vessel whose name meant nothing yet to history but would mean a great deal by the time this story finished, watched the last shimmer of violet light fade from the eastern sky and felt, in the particular way that people who have survived long enough on the Grand Line learn to feel things, that the world had just quietly, irreversibly changed shape beneath her feet. Something came through, she said to her first mate, not as a question. Something came through, he agreed. She was quiet for a moment, weighing the shape of a decision she hadn't yet been given enough information to make, and then she smiled. The particular hungry smile of someone who has just realized the game board has more squares on it than she thought yesterday. Then we'd better find it, she said, before the Marines decide it belongs to them. Beerus, 400 miles from either conversation and blissfully unaware of both, was currently floating cross-legged above the deck of the Halcyon's Reach, eating, with visible escalating disappointment, a plate of ship's rations that Marchetti had, out of some combination of desperation and instinct, offered him as a gesture of goodwill. "This," Beerus said, holding up a piece of hardtack between two fingers like it had personally wronged him, "is an insult." He turned his golden eyes on Marchetti, and something in them, not quite amusement, not quite threat, some third thing this world had no word for yet, glinted sharp. "Take me somewhere with actual food," he said, "and I'll consider not destroying this ship out of principle." Marchetti, who had built a career on reading exactly how serious a threat was behind a given sentence, understood immediately that this was not, technically, a joke, and that the fate of everyone currently standing on this deck had just been quietly wagered on the quality of a meal. "There's a port town 2 hours north," he said carefully. "Good food, not primitive, I promise." Beerus considered this. Somewhere above them, the sky remained stubbornly, unhelpfully blue and ordinary, giving no sign at all of the war rooms now waking up across two oceans because of what had briefly torn through it. 2 hours, Beerus said, unfolding himself from midair with the languid grace of a being who had never once in his existence needed to hurry for anyone. "This world has exactly 2 hours to impress me. After that," he let the sentence hang, the way gods do. "We'll see." The port town of Variant K had never, in its 200 years of unremarkable existence, hosted a god. It had hosted pirates, certainly, small-time ones mostly, rookies working their way up from East Blue reputations that meant nothing out here, the occasional bounty hunter passing through on a tip that never panned out. It had hosted Marines on routine patrol, merchants haggling over fish prices, and once, memorably, a minor noble's yacht that had run aground on the reef and caused 3 weeks of gossip. It had never hosted anything that made the air itself feel thinner just by standing in it, and the town's collective nervous system knew this on some animal level long before anyone explained why. The moment Beerus set foot, actual foot, on actual cobblestone, having apparently decided walking the last stretch was beneath even flying, on its main street. Marchetti walked half a pace behind him, close enough to look like an escort, far enough to not look like a leash, which was the exact balance his training had spent years teaching him to hold. He'd sent 2 more Viva card dispatches on the walk from the docks, one confirming their destination, one flagging, with as much professional restraint as he could manage, that the situation had entered what his superiors were going to want to call a delicate phase. Delicate, he murmured to himself, watching Beerus pause outside a dockside restaurant to sniff the air with the exacting scrutiny of a wine critic, is one word for it. The restaurant was called the Salted Gull, run by a broad-shouldered woman named Orsa, who had, over 30 years, fed everyone from Yonko-adjacent muscle to Marine admirals passing through incognito, and who had therefore developed the specific, unshakable calm of someone who had decided long ago that no customer, however strange, was going to rattle her kitchen. She took one look at the purple-skinned, cat-eared stranger settling himself at her best table, floating an inch above the chair rather than sitting in it, as though contact with furniture was an indignity he'd only recently begun tolerating, and did not blink. "What'll it be?" she said. Beerus turned his full attention on her, and for the first time since the rift had closed, something in his posture eased, fractionally, the way a man relaxes when he finally meets someone who understands the assignment. "Everything," he said. "Bring me everything good you have, and do not," he added, with the weight of a being laying down a law of physics, "bring me anything you would call hardtack." Orsa's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "We don't serve hardtack here, sugar. Sit tight." What followed, over the next 90 minutes, was, by Marchetti's own later account, filed with a level of detail his superiors found faintly absurd given the stakes. One of the strangest diplomatic encounters in Marine history, conducted entirely across a growing wall of empty plates. Grilled Sea King steak, seasoned with a blend of spices unique to the Eastern New World ports. A whole roasted fish stuffed with citrus and herbs Orsa grew herself in pots behind the kitchen. Fried dumplings the size of a fist, 3 different sauces, a soup whose exact contents Orsa refused to disclose on principle. Beerus ate through all of it with the focused, wordless intensity of a being conducting genuine scientific research, and by the 4th course, Marchetti realized something had shifted in the god's mood that no amount of careful questioning had managed to shift on its own. "This," Beerus said, around a mouthful of dumpling, "is acceptable." He said it the way another being might have said magnificent. And Marchetti, who by now had spent enough hours in this creature's presence to start reading the register beneath the words, understood it as high praise indeed. "Then can I ask you something?" Marchetti said, "while you're in a generous mood?" Beerus's ears flicked toward him, not quite committing to attention, but not dismissing the question either. "You can ask," he said. "Whether I answer depends on whether the question bores me." Marchetti had rehearsed a dozen ways into this conversation on the walk from the docks, and discarded all of them because he understood, with the same instinct that had kept him alive through 14 years of Cipher Pol fieldwork, that this was not a creature who responded to strategy. It responded to honesty, the way a king responds better to a subject who doesn't flatter him. "What are you?" he said simply. "Not your name. I heard that part. Back on the ship. God of destruction. I mean, what does that mean? What do you do? What made that bullet stop existing instead of just stopping? Beerus set down the dumpling he'd been holding, and for a moment, something passed behind his golden eyes that Marchetti hadn't seen yet. Not irritation, not boredom, something closer to the ancient, tired weight of a being who has answered a version of this question more times than he can remember, in more worlds than this one has names for. I destroy things, Beerus said. That's the job. Not villains, not monsters, though I've destroyed a few of those too, when they earned it. I destroy what needs destroying to keep the universe. My universe, not this one, though I suppose that distinction is becoming complicated. Imbalance. Stars that have gone wrong. Civilizations that have gone rotten past the point of saving. Occasionally, and here something flickered, almost fond, almost bitter, a planet when the alternative was worse. He picked the dumpling back up, examined it, set it back down again, uninterested now. I am not a soldier, I am not a weapon, though people mistake me for one, right up until it kills them. I am closer to, he paused, searching, in a language not his own, for a concept this world might actually hold, a scale. Something has to sit on the other side of creation, or creation tips over and takes everyone down with it. That's me. That's been me for longer than your entire species has had a word for history. The words settled into the space between them and Marchetti, who had interrogated liars, war criminals, and once, memorably, a man who claimed to be three separate people, found he had no follow-up ready, because for the first time in a very long professional life, he believed every word of what he'd just heard, completely, without needing to check it against anything. Does it need balancing? Beerus considered this for a long moment, gaze drifting past Marchetti's shoulder, out through the restaurant's open window toward the harbor, toward the ships and the flags and the enormous, restless machinery of a world built entirely, Marchetti realized, watching him look at it, on the specific violence of people fighting each other for the right to be strongest. Kings and pirates and marines and gods dressed as men, all of it running on the same fuel, the same appetite, dressed up in 100 different flags. Not yet, Beerus said finally. But I've been here 6 hours, and I've already met 3 separate kinds of fool who think power means they don't have to think. His tail flicked, once, sharp. That's usually where it starts. It was the 5th course, a plate of something Orsa called stormcatch, 3 kinds of shellfish drowning in a butter sauce dark with spice, that the trouble arrived, because trouble, on the grand line, does not wait for a convenient pause in the conversation. The Salted Gull's door didn't so much open as get shouldered aside, and 6 men filed in wearing the loose, mismatched colors of a crew whose captain had clearly decided uniforms were beneath his ambitions. A rookie outfit, bounty posters barely a year old between the lot of them, but armed and loud with the particular confidence of men who had recently won a fight they shouldn't have, and hadn't yet learned the lesson that teaches. Their leader, a broad man with a scar bisecting one eyebrow and a bounty of 40 million on his head that he clearly considered an insult, scanned the room, spotted the marine coat on Marchetti's shoulder, and grinned like Christmas had come early. Well, well, he said, Cipher Pol, sitting pretty in my town, without an escort worth spitting on. Someone upstairs really doesn't like you, friend. Marchetti did not reach for a weapon. He had, by now, developed a very specific and rapidly evolving theory about what happened to violence directed at the being currently working through a plate of shellfish across the table from him, and he was, on balance, curious to see it confirmed. "You should leave," Marchetti said. "Now, while that's still an option you have." The pirate captain laughed, loud and genuine, and gestured his crew forward. And it was here, precisely here, that Beerus, without looking up from his food, without so much as pausing the motion of the shellfish fork halfway to his mouth, spoke. "Sit down," he said, "or don't. But if you break one more plate in this restaurant, I am going to be extremely unhappy, and you do not want to see what that looks like." The pirate captain's eyes swung to him, small, purple, unimpressive at a glance, floating an inch above a chair like he was too good for furniture, and made the single worst read of a room in the recorded history of the Grand Line. "And who?" the captain said, striding forward, hand dropping to the hilt of a cutlass. "Are you supposed to—" He didn't finish the sentence. He never got the chance to, because the air around him simply stopped behaving like air. It was not a blast. It was not a visible technique. Nothing that would have made for a dramatic silhouette against a sunset. It was closer to the sensation of gravity itself losing patience, a pressure that dropped onto every man in that doorway at once and held them, mid-stride, utterly and completely still, muscles locked, eyes wide, as though the universe itself had simply declined to let them move any further in this direction. Beerus finally looked up, set down his fork. And for the first time since the ship, Marchetti saw something in his expression that was not boredom, not curiosity, not even mild irritation. Something older and colder and infinitely more patient. The expression of a being reminding a room, gently, exactly how the universe actually worked beneath the story it told itself about being in charge. "I was having," Beerus said, "a very nice meal." He rose from the chair, properly this time, feet finding the floor. And though he stood barely 5 feet tall, every person in the Salted Gull felt the room reorganize itself around him, like gravity had quietly, permanently changed address. This world has been extraordinarily fortunate so far, in that the first thing it showed me was decent food and one reasonably intelligent man with a ledger. His golden eyes swept the frozen pirates one by one, cataloging them the way a man catalogs insects he's deciding whether to bother with. "You," he said, "are testing whether that good fortune continues." The pressure in the room did not lift so much as acknowledge itself, and every plate on every table in the restaurant, without exception, cracked cleanly in half down the center, the food atop them undisturbed, the wood beneath them unmarked, nothing broken but the porcelain itself, in perfect, silent unison. Orsa, watching from the kitchen doorway with a dish towel still in her hands, made a small strangled sound that was equal parts horror and, despite everything, professional outrage. "That," Beerus said, into the ringing silence that followed, "was one plate's worth of unhappy. You have exactly no interest in finding out what a second plate's worth looks like." The pirate captain, released all at once from whatever unseen hand had held him, did not draw his cutlass. He did not finish his sentence. He turned, considerably paler than he'd arrived, and walked his crew back out the door at a pace that was not quite running only because his legs had not yet remembered how. The restaurant exhaled as one. Orsa set down her dish towel, looked at the field of shattered plates now scattered across every table in her establishment, food perfectly intact atop each ruined half, and after a long moment laughed, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound. "Well," she said, "I've had worse critics." She began gathering the pieces. "New plates are on the house, I suppose, seeing as you're clearly a man who tips well in fear." Beerus, resettling into his seat, looked almost pleased. "I like her," he said to Marchetti, as though Orsa weren't standing 4 feet away. "She's not afraid of me. That's rare. Usually takes people a lot longer to figure out that fear is a waste of the time they have left to enjoy things." Marchetti, whose hands had not stopped being perfectly still throughout the entire encounter, finally let himself breathe. "You could have killed them," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was, he realized, closer to genuine surprise. "I could have unmade this entire town without pausing my meal," Beerus said, entirely without boast, the way another man might mention the weather. "I didn't, because they weren't worth the effort, and because," he paused, considering the half-eaten plate in front of him with something almost like reflection, "I find I'm curious, for the moment, what this world does next, whether it learns." "Most don't." He picked his fork back up. "You're taking notes for your superiors, aren't you, about all of this?" It wasn't a question, and Marchetti didn't pretend otherwise. "Yes." "Good," Beerus said. "Tell them exactly what happened here." "Every word. And tell them," his golden eyes lifted, met Marchetti's, held them with the specific, ancient weight of a warning that would not be repeated, that whatever they decide to do about me, they have exactly one chance to decide correctly. "I've been patient today because the food was good and the company was interesting. That patience is not a permanent feature. It is a mood. And moods," he said, returning to his meal, "change." Outside, word of what had happened at the Salted Gull was already spreading through Varent K's docks at the particular speed that only fear and gossip, working together, can achieve. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in 3 different directions at once, 3 different powers who had spent the day arguing over what this stranger might be, were about to receive the same report and arrive independently at the same uneasy conclusion. That whatever had crossed into their world that morning was not a threat to be measured against anything they had ever fought before, and that the old rules, the ones about strength, about territory, about who bowed to whom, had just, quietly and without ceremony, stopped applying. By the time the sun set on Varent K, the story of the god who cracked plates without touching them had already outrun every ship capable of carrying it, which was, Marchetti reflected, the peculiar nature of information in a world stitched together by nothing but water and rumor. It didn't need a fast boat. It needed a drunk sailor with a good story and a bar full of strangers, and the Grand Line had an inexhaustible supply of both. Sengoku received the full report in his Marineford office at dusk, standing rather than sitting, because sitting felt, somehow, insufficiently serious for what he was reading. Marchetti's account was thorough to the point of exhaustion, dialogue transcribed nearly verbatim, the destroyed plates described with an almost forensic precision, the phrase that patience is not a permanent feature underlined twice in the agent's own hand, which was, for a man of Marchetti's professional restraint, as close to a scream as his paperwork ever came. He let them live, Sengoku said, half to himself, half to the three admirals now gathered around the long table, and destroyed the plates instead, as a lesson. A god with a sense of proportion, one of the admirals said. It was not a comforting thought, and he did not deliver it as one. That is, in some ways, more frightening than one without. Explain, Sengoku said. A being with no restraint we can predict, the admiral said. It burns everything, eventually, and burns itself out doing it, or gets stopped by something bigger. A being that chooses precisely how much force to use, enough to terrify, not enough to escalate past what the moment requires. That's not an animal. That's a mind, and minds negotiate, which means this is no longer purely a containment problem. He tapped the report at the underlined sentence. It's a diplomatic one, and we are astonishingly unpracticed at diplomacy, with something that could erase Marineford from the sea without breaking its stride. The Gorosei, gathered by transponder snail an hour later, arrived at the same conclusion through a colder arithmetic. We do not have the strength to compel this creature to anything, the eldest elder said, into the heavy quiet of the war room. That option does not exist. What we have is the ability to be first. First to speak with it honestly, first to offer something it might actually want, before Kaido's people, or Big Mom's people, or gods forbid the revolutionaries manage the same. We cannot own a god. We may, if we are exceptionally careful, be able to avoid becoming its enemy. A pause, heavy with everything the sentence wasn't saying, send Sengoku himself. Not soldiers, not a fleet, which would only look like exactly the kind of foolish provocation that got a rookie crew nearly erased today. Send one man with an open hand and pray he is convincing. 200 miles south, aboard the pirate vessel that had first caught the shimmer of Beerus's arrival from the deck rail, the woman with the sharp eyes, her name, when it finally mattered to write it down, was Captain Reva Kessler, a rookie by New World standards but not by temperament, with a bounty climbing fast enough that older established names had begun asking questions about her, had spent the day doing what she did best, listening. He ate an entire restaurant stock in one sitting, her first mate reported, relaying the third and most detailed version of the Variant K story to reach them by evening. Cracked every plate in the place without laying a finger on anyone, then told the Marine escort to write it all down and deliver a message. No blood, no bodies, just a demonstration. Reva turned this over slowly, the way she turned over every piece of intelligence that crossed her deck, looking for the angle nobody else had thought to look for yet. A god who prefers demonstrations to massacres, she said. That's not what I expected from something with a title like Destroyer. She looked out at the darkening water, toward the direction Variant K lay, 200 miles and a full day's hard sailing distant. That means he's not just powerful, he's patient. And patient gods are the ones who actually get asked to pick sides, because they're the only ones who will actually listen to the pitch. You're thinking about recruiting him, her first mate said. It wasn't quite disbelief. On this crew, disbelief had mostly worn itself out months ago. I'm thinking, Reva said, that every Yonko in the New World is about to make the same play, and every one of them is going to do it wrong, with tribute, with threats, with the same tired performance of strength that's worked on every rookie and every rival crew for the last 20 years. None of it is going to work on something that unmade a bullet before it landed. She smiled, slow and considering. So I'm not going to compete on strength. I'm going to compete on being the only person in this entire ocean who asks him what he wants, instead of telling him what I want from him. She turned from the rail, set a course for Variant K, and somebody find me everything we know about gods, from any story, any legend, any drunk old sailor's tall tale. I want to know what a being like that actually values, before I walk up and waste his time. Beerus, unaware and largely uninterested in the fact that he had, within the space of a single day, become the single most urgent item on the agenda of at least 4 separate power structures spanning 2 oceans, had elected to spend the evening doing something that would have struck every strategist now maneuvering around him as almost insultingly anticlimactic. He was asleep, floating 3 feet above a rented room's very inadequate bed in Variant K's only inn, having declared the mattress an affront and the pillow worse. Marchetti, posted outside the door on what he privately admitted to himself was less a guard duty and more a vigil, used the quiet hours to finish his report. The real one, the one that wouldn't go in any official file, written in the specific, unadorned language he reserved for things his superiors needed to understand rather than merely read. "He is not what we prepared for," he wrote. "We have contingency files for ancient weapons, for hypothetical ancient weapon tier devil fruits, for ancient civilizations returned, for every worst-case scenario the Gorosei's paranoia has managed to imagine over 400 years, and none of them describe what walked through that rift. Every prior worst case assumed a being that wanted something conventional, territory, revenge, conquest, survival. This one wants good food and to not be bored. I do not know if that makes him easier to manage or immeasurably harder, because I do not know what happens on the day this world finally fails to entertain him. Recommendation: do not attempt force under any circumstance, at any tier of escalation, including combined Admiral and Yonko level engagement. I do not believe such an engagement would end in anything resembling a fight. I believe it would end the way the bullet ended, quietly, immediately, and without anyone present understanding what had happened until it was already finished. Recommendation: send someone with the authority to actually negotiate and the humility to understand that negotiation, here, does not mean the world government sets the terms. For possibly the first time in this organization's history, we are not the strongest party at the table. I would suggest we get comfortable with that fact quickly, because I do not believe he will tolerate being condescended to for very long. He was still writing when the door beside him opened, without sound, without warning, and Beerus stood in the frame, awake, apparently, and looking at Marchetti with an expression that suggested he'd been listening to considerably more than the scratch of a pen for some time now. "You think loudly," Beerus said, "for a man who prides himself on saying so little." Marchetti closed the notebook, unhurried, though his pulse had not gotten the same instruction. "Can't help what my superiors need to know." "No," Beerus agreed. "I suppose you can't." He drifted out into the hallway, robes settling around him with the same unhurried weightlessness he did everything with, and looked down the narrow stairwell toward the inn's common room, where, even at this hour, low voices and the clink of glasses suggested Variant K's population had found reasons not to sleep either. "Tell me something," he said. "Your Marines, your government, This entire apparatus, this whole machine you've built to keep order. His tail flicked, considering. Does it work? Marchetti considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because he understood, by now, that Beerus did not ask questions he didn't intend to actually weigh the answer to. Depends who you ask, he said. It keeps a kind of peace, an ugly one. It stops the worst of the worst sometimes. It also protects things that don't deserve protecting, and crushes things that didn't deserve crushing, and calls both of those things order, because order is the only thing it actually knows how to sell. He paused. I've spent 14 years inside it. I still don't know if the answer is yes. Something in Beerus's expression shifted. Not warmth, not quite, but a kind of recognition. The specific respect one weary, honest thing occasionally extends to another. That, he said, is the first completely honest answer anyone in this world has given me since I arrived. Careful, I might start expecting more of them. He turned, drifting back toward the room. Your superiors are sending someone tomorrow, someone important, judging by how hard the air's been vibrating with nervous transponder snail chatter all evening. It wasn't a guess. Marchetti had long since stopped being surprised by what this creature simply knew. Tell them not to bring soldiers. Tell them to bring someone who can answer questions the way you just did, instead of the way governments usually do. His golden eyes caught the low hall light, unreadable. And tell them, he added, almost as an afterthought, pausing at the door, that they are not the only ones who've decided to come find me. I can feel more of them gathering already, out there, on the water, deciding what I'm worth to them. A slow, humorless smile. This world is about to get very interesting very fast. I'd almost forgotten how much I enjoy watching that happen. The door closed behind him, soft as a held breath, and Marchetti stood alone in the narrow hallway of a dockside inn that, 24 hours ago, had been utterly unremarkable, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes only at the exact moment history quietly pivots beneath a person's feet, that whatever peace this world had built for itself, however ugly, however imperfect, had just been handed its final exam, and that no one currently racing toward Variant K from every direction at once had the faintest idea yet what the correct answer looked like. Outside, far above the sleeping town, the stars over the Grand Line burned exactly as they always had, indifferent, ancient, unbothered, and somewhere among them, in a corner of existence this world had no name for, an attendant with pale blue skin and an unhurried manner noted, with the mild interest of someone checking in on an old and familiar habit, that his lord had been gone rather longer than a nap this time, and began, without any particular urgency, to wonder if perhaps it was time to go and see what he'd found. Sengoku arrived at Variant K a little past noon the next day, alone but for a single aide, in a modest transport ship stripped of the usual marine pageantry, no banners, no honor guard, no cannon salute. It was, Marchetti understood immediately upon seeing it dock, a message in itself. The world government, for perhaps the first time in living memory, had chosen to arrive somewhere looking smaller than it was, rather than larger. Beerus was waiting for him on the pier, floating cross-legged a few feet above the weathered planks, having apparently decided that meeting his visitor in the open, in full view of the gathering crowd of fishermen and dockhands who'd already learned exactly who he was, suited his mood better than another closed room. Marchetti stood a respectful distance off, Close enough to intervene if intervention were somehow possible. Far enough to let the conversation belong to the two men actually having it. Sengoku stepped off the gangway, straightened his coat, and did the thing that would be talked about in Marine academies for decades afterward. He bowed. Not deeply, not obsequiously. A measured, formal inclination of the head, the kind offered between equals who each understood exactly how dangerous the other could be. "Fleet Admiral Sengoku," he said, "I lead the naval forces of the world government. I understand you've had an eventful 2 days." Beerus regarded him for a long moment, gold eyes taking in the bow, the absence of soldiers, the careful, deliberate humility of a man who had clearly been coached, or had coached himself, not to make the mistake every other fool in this world had made so far. "You're smarter than the last man who tried to impress me with a title," Beerus said. "That's a start." He drifted down, boots finding the pier's worn wood, and the crowd at the edge of the docks, watching from a respectful distance, went very quiet. "Say what you came to say." Sengoku did not waste the opening with pleasantries. "I came to ask what you want," he said, "not what we can offer you. I understand by now that we have very little that would actually interest a being like yourself. I came to ask honestly because I'm told honesty is the only currency you've found worth anything here so far." Something in Beerus's expression eased, fractionally. The same shift Marchetti had seen the night before. The specific respect this creature reserved for people who stopped performing at him. "Better," Beerus said. "Much better." He considered the question with genuine weight, tail curling once behind him. "I don't want your throne. I don't want your gold, your ships, your obedience. I've had obedience from beings far more impressive than any of you, and it bores me faster than almost anything else does." He looked past Sengoku, out at the harbor, at the ordinary, chaotic sprawl of a world running entirely on ambition and hunger. "What I want," he said slowly, "is to understand what I've landed in the middle of before I decide whether it's worth my attention at all. Right now, this world looks like a very large, very loud argument that's been going on so long everyone's forgotten what started it. Kings and pirates and governments, all convinced their particular flavor of violence is the correct one." His gaze sharpened, fixed on Sengoku with sudden, total focus. "Convince me it's more than that. Convince me there's something here actually worth balancing, instead of something I should simply let finish burning itself out." The silence that followed stretched long enough that even the gathered crowd, held at a respectful distance, seemed to lean in without moving. "I can't convince you of that in one conversation," Sengoku said finally, and the honesty of it, the refusal to oversell, to promise more than the truth could carry, visibly registered with Beerus as the correct answer, even before Sengoku finished it. "I've spent my entire life inside this argument you're describing, and some days I don't believe it either. But I've also seen what happens in the places where nobody's left to hold any kind of line at all. And it isn't peace. It's just whoever's cruelest, unchecked. I don't think this world's worth saving because it's good. I think it's worth the attempt, because the alternative is worse. And because some of the people in it, not many, but some, are actually trying to make it better, despite everything working against them." He met Beerus's eyes without flinching. "That's not a pitch. That's just what 14 years, no, 40, of doing this job has taught me." "Take it or leave it." For a long moment, Beerus said nothing at all, and in that silence, Something passed behind his ancient golden eyes that no one on that pier, not Sengoku, not Marchetti, not the crowd of ordinary fishermen holding their breath at a safe distance, could fully read. Then, slowly, he smiled, and it was not the sharp, dangerous smile he'd worn at the Salted Gull. It was something quieter. "You didn't lie to me once," Beerus said. "Not once, in an entire conversation, when lying would have been so much easier. Do you know how rare that is? Across every world I've ever set foot in?" He drifted upward again, slow, considering, robes settling around him. "I'm not going to promise you anything yet, Fleet Admiral. I don't make promises to worlds I've known for 2 days. But I'll tell you this much." His gaze swept the harbor once more, out toward the horizon where, even now, Marchetti could see the first dark speck of an approaching ship, cutting hard and fast through the water. Still an hour out, but closing. "I'm not leaving yet. Not while it's still this interesting." The ship on the horizon was Reva Kessler's, and she made port at Variant K just as the sun began its long slide toward evening, having pushed her crew and her rigging harder in 18 hours than she had in the 6 months prior combined. She came ashore without an escort of her own, cutlass at her hip but hand nowhere near it, and walked the length of the pier toward the small, strange gathering at its end with the specific, measured confidence of a woman who had spent the entire voyage rehearsing exactly one thing, not what she wanted to say, but how completely she intended to mean it. Sengoku's aide moved to intercept her. Sengoku himself, watching, raised a hand and stopped him, because he too had understood by now that the old rules about who got to approach whom had quietly stopped applying the moment that rift tore open the sky. Riva stopped a respectful distance from Beerus, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to not presume familiarity she hadn't earned. She did not bow. She had decided, somewhere over those 18 brutal hours of sailing, that a bow would have been exactly the kind of performance Beerus had already made clear he had no patience for. "I'm not here to offer you a crew," she said before anyone could ask on his behalf. "I've heard what happens to people who try to buy you with tribute or threats. I'm not stupid enough to repeat their mistake." She held his gaze, steady despite everything in her screaming to look away. "I'm here because I want to know what you actually think of this world, now that you've seen a slice of it. Not what we can give you, what you think, because everyone else who's come looking for you in the last 2 days wants something from you. I just want to hear the honest answer." Beerus turned to consider her fully for the first time, and something in his expression, sharp, assessing, the specific attention he'd shown almost no one since the rift closed behind him, settled onto her like weight. "Interesting," he said, echoing, without seeming to realize it, the very first word he'd spoken in this world at all. "You're the first pirate who's asked me a question instead of an offer." His tail flicked, slow, thoughtful. "What do I think of this world?" He considered it with the seriousness the question deserved, gaze drifting between Sengoku, standing patient and honest at one end of the pier, and Reva, standing bold and unbowed at the other. The Marine and the pirate, the order and the ambition, both of them, in their own ways, having passed the only test that had actually mattered to him. "I think," Beerus said slowly, "that it is louder, hungrier, and more violent than it needs to be. I think most of the people running it have confused strength with rightness, which is the oldest and stupidest mistake any civilization ever makes, and I have watched entire universes destroy themselves over exactly that confusion. His golden eyes swept the harbor once more, the ships, the flags, the enormous restless machine of a world built on the specific hunger to be strongest. And I think, he said quieter now, that underneath all of that noise there are a small number of people in it who are actually asking the right questions for once, instead of simply grabbing for what they want. His gaze settled, deliberate, between the fleet admiral and the pirate captain both. That's more than I expected to find. It's not nothing. He rose then, unhurried, until he floated a full 10 feet above the pier, robes catching the last long light of the afternoon, and looked down at the small, strange, unlikely gathering he'd assembled around himself in barely 48 hours. A Cipher Pol agent with an honest pen, a fleet admiral who refused to lie, a pirate captain who'd asked the only real question anyone had thought to ask. "I'm not finished deciding what this world is worth," Beerus said, "or whether it deserves to keep existing exactly as it is, unbalanced and hungry, and drowning in its own noise." His voice carried easily across the pier, across the gathered crowd, across the water itself, and somewhere far above, though none of them could yet see it, a second seam of violet-black light had begun, quietly, to unstitch itself against the blue, smaller than the first, more deliberate, the specific signature of a being who did not fall through the sky by accident. But I'll say this much, to everyone currently listening and everyone who sent someone here to listen on their behalf. His golden eyes swept the pier one final time. Whatever you're planning to do about me, whoever you're planning to send, whatever offer you're preparing, whatever fight you think you might eventually have to have, do it honestly, or don't bother at all. I've been patient because this world so far has occasionally managed to surprise me. The air around him tightened, subtle, ancient, a pressure that every person on that pier felt settle into their bones without a single visible gesture to explain it. That patience, he said, is the only gift I intend to give it. Waste it, and you'll learn exactly why they call me what they call me. Above them the second rift widened, slow and silent, and through it, unhurried, serene, carrying a thin staff and wearing the faint, knowing smile of someone who had done this exact search 100 times before across 100 worlds, an attendant with pale blue skin and white hair drawn into a topknot began, at last, his own quiet descent. "My lord," Whis called down, pleasant as a man remarking on the weather, "you really must stop wandering off during my baking. I only just found you." Beerus, for the first time since he'd arrived in this world, laughed, short, genuine, and entirely without menace, and on the pier below, Sengoku, Marchetti, and Reva Kessler watched a god greet his oldest companion, and understood, each in their own way, that whatever came next for this world had just gained one more variable none of them had been prepared for. Whis touched down on the pier with the unhurried grace of a being who had never once in his existence needed to rush, staff resting lightly against one shoulder, and inclined his head toward the assembled wide-eyed gathering with the pleasant, unbothered courtesy of someone being introduced at a garden party rather than stepping into a world he'd never seen before. "Please, don't mind me," he said, to no one in particular and everyone at once. "I'm merely here to collect him before he does something regrettable to your solar system out of boredom." He turned to Beerus, serene smile unwavering. You've been gone considerably longer than a nap, my lord. I do hope you've been minding your manners. I destroyed some plates, Beerus said, entirely unbothered. On principle. Naturally, Whis said, as though this were the most reasonable sentence in the world, and something in the easy, familiar rhythm between them, master and attendant, old friends wearing the shapes of God and servant, struck every human witness on that pier with the same quiet, vertiginous realization that whatever they had spent 2 days learning to fear, to court, to carefully negotiate with, was, in the end, simply someone. Someone with a friend who scolded him gently. Someone capable, apparently, of being managed in the specific, patient way old companions manage each other. Sengoku, watching this, understood something shift in the room. Not the danger, which hadn't lessened by a single degree, but the shape of it. A god who could be teased by an old friend was still a god, but he was also, unmistakably, a person, and persons, Sengoku's whole career had taught him, could be reasoned with in ways that forces of nature could not. Lord Beerus, Sengoku said, choosing the title deliberately, watching it land. You said this world hadn't finished proving itself to you. I'd like to ask, properly, formally, on behalf of the government I serve, what would change your mind? Not to flatter you into staying, to actually know. Beerus considered this, drifting back down from where Whis' arrival had lifted his attention skyward, and looked out, one final time, at the harbor of Verant Cay, the fishing boats, the modest docks, the ordinary, unremarkable town that had, through no fault or ambition of its own, become the exact center of the largest realignment of power this world had seen in longer than any living historian could measure. Nothing changes my mind today, Beerus said. I don't decide things quickly, and I don't decide them for an audience. His gaze moved, deliberate, across each of them in turn. Sengoku, Marchetti, Reva, the crowd of ordinary townsfolk still holding their breath at a respectful distance. But I'll say this, since apparently honesty is the only thing that's impressed me since I got here. He paused, and for a moment, something almost gentle moved behind the ancient weight of his eyes. I've destroyed worlds that gave me less reason to hesitate than this one has. In 2 days, without even trying particularly hard to convince me. That's not nothing, that's not a promise either. But it's a door I'm leaving open, which is more than I generally bother to do. Whis, at his shoulder, tilted his head with polite interest. Does this mean we're staying a while longer, my lord? It means, Beerus said, that I'm curious. Which is, historically, the single most dangerous mood I'm capable of having, for everyone involved, myself included. He allowed the faintest ghost of a smile. Tell your kings and your Yonko and whoever else has been sharpening their pitch on the water this past day that I'll be watching. Not hunting, not judging, not yet. Watching. His voice, when it continued, dropped into something quieter, almost private, meant less for the gathered crowd than for the 3 people who had actually earned 2 days of his genuine attention. The ones who lied to me, or tried to buy me, or postured at me like I was just another power to be outmaneuvered. I've already forgotten their names. The ones who told me the truth even when the truth wasn't flattering. His gaze found Sengoku, then Marchetti, then, last and longest, Reva. Those, I remember. That's worth more to a being like me than any fleet you could raise or any throne you could offer. Remember that, the next time you're deciding how to greet something you don't understand. He rose then, unhurried, into the long gold light of the dying afternoon, Whis falling into an easy, practiced orbit beside him, and the second rift, smaller, calmer, entirely without the violence its predecessor's arrival had implied, began slowly to open once more against the darkening sky, not to take him home, not yet, but simply, it seemed, to remind this small, loud, hungry world that the door between them had never really been fully closed, and might not be again. "I'm not leaving," Beerus said, almost as an afterthought, glancing back down at the three of them one last time. "Not yet. This world still owes me a few more honest conversations before I've made up my mind about it. And frankly, a small, genuine, almost human smile. The food really was very good." His eyes found Orsa's restaurant, distant down the pier, one last time. "Tell that woman I expect the same quality next time, and better plates." And then, without ceremony, without thunder, without the sky tearing the way the old stories would inevitably wrongly claim it had, he simply drifted upward into the fading light, Whis at his side, and let the ordinary evening close in soft and quiet around a world that had spent 2 impossible days learning, in real time, exactly how small its oldest arguments truly were against the scale of what actually existed beyond its own horizon. Variant K returned in the days that followed to something that resembled its old shape: fishing boats going out at dawn, the Salted Gull reopening with new plates and a story its regulars would tell for the rest of their lives, the tide coming in and going out the way it always had, indifferent to gods and governments both. But nothing, underneath that surface calm, was quite the same, and everyone who'd stood on that pier knew it. Sengoku returned to Marineford carrying not a victory, not a treaty, not the tidy resolution his superiors had hoped for, but something rarer and, in its way, more valuable. Proof that the strongest thing in this world was not, after all, unreasonable, only unimpressed, and that the only currency that had ever mattered to it was the one his organization found hardest to spend. Marchetti's report became, within a year, required reading in a training program that hadn't existed before that week and would go on to shape Cipher Pol doctrine for a generation. And Reva Kessler sailed back into the new world with no crew, no treasure, and no alliance to show for 18 brutal hours of hard sailing. Only the quiet, private certainty that somewhere above this ocean, something ancient and terrible and against every expectation, fundamentally fair was watching, and that being remembered by it, rather than feared by it, might turn out to be the single most valuable thing anyone in this world could earn. The sky above the Grand Line closed that evening the way it always had, blue fading to violet, violet fading to the deep, star-scattered black of an ordinary night, and gave no sign, to anyone who hadn't been there, that a god had ever walked its waters at all. But somewhere out past the horizon, in the quiet dark between one world and the next, Beerus drifted homeward beside an old friend who was already, gently, needling him about the state of his robes, and allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, the small private satisfaction of having found something worth coming back for.